All right, good evening, and welcome to the district's first of many public workshops on the district's on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. My name is Nick Turner. I'm the General Manager of Montecito Water District. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to provide you with an overview of SGMA and also to provide notice of the district's intent to form a groundwater sustainability agency for the Montecito groundwater basin. This meeting would also provide all of you with the opportunity to ask questions and share your concerns with us regarding this process. In October of 2016, the district's board of directors voted unanimously in favor of initiating the process of forming a groundwater sustainability agency for the Montecito Water District and for the Montecito groundwater basin, Although not currently required to participate in SGMA, the district, being the local public agency with water supply authority over the basin, recognizes that groundwater is a key component of our multifaceted water supply portfolio, currently being our only local reliable supply. And it's critical that we protect our groundwater supply through proactive management at a local level to improve the reliability of the basin, and not just for the district, but for all of us. Tonight's meeting is just the beginning of a lengthy process of forming a groundwater sustainability agency and ultimately developing and implementing a groundwater sustainability plan which achieves sustainability in the Montecito groundwater basin. There will be future opportunities for more involvement of any of the interested stakeholders. So our agenda for tonight, we'll go through introductions and the purpose of this meeting. Representatives from DUDAC will provide an overview of the SGMA legislation, the implementation procedures for a groundwater sustainability agency and a groundwater sustainability plan, and why SGMA is important for our basin. Then we will then open it up for questions at about 7 o'clock. If anyone's interested and anticipates asking questions, there are speaker slips outside the door. And then we will adjourn the meeting at about 7:45. We will stick around if anyone's interested in talking with any of us directly. So introductions. The district's board of directors. First, we have Dick Shagowitz, the president of the board. Doug Morgan is the vice president. Sam Fry, Director Sam Fry, Director Tobe Plow, and Director Floyd Wicks. We also have Doss Williams here tonight. He's not here yet. And also his chief of staff, Darcel Elliott, is also here. Also joining us will be Joshua Hagmark from the city, although I don't think he's here yet, and Bob McDonald, the general manager for Carpinteria Valley Water District. And we also have Jane Gray, who's a regional planner and project manager for DUDAC, and Matt Naftali, the principal hydrologist, who both will be giving the presentation for the evening. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jane and Matt.
Good evening. Thank you all for gathering here, spending some time with us on a beautiful Thursday evening to talk about water. We'll go through some acronyms very quickly. They're all up here. I'm not going to name them one by one, but you can certainly refer to them as we move through the PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions, please do hold them till the end. There's going to be time for you to ask your questions and give comments. Purpose of the meeting. So as Nick already stated, this is the first of many public and stakeholder outreach meetings that we will be convening throughout the groundwater sustainability formation process. One purpose is to notice you all that this is occurring and provide a forum for community engagement to take your comments and questions and concerns, to provide an overall kind of very broad understanding of what the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is, sort of a Sigma 101, and how that applies to the Montecito Groundwater Basin. As Nick gave you a preface on, to communicate the importance of the groundwater basin as your local and sustainable supply, sort of the last defense that you have, particularly in times of drought. And again, just dialogue with you. We have heard from community already before we initiated the process and during the initiation process at the board. Some of those basic community concerns that we have heard are seawater intrusion, cost implications of Sigma and the GSA and GSP, issues of basin overdraft, issues of local stewardship of groundwater resources, preservation of concern regarding the preservation of landscaping and the aesthetic that Montecito enjoys, uses of agriculture in the basin, the community and stakeholder component of the process, issues related to water rights, concerns about metering of wells, groundwater basin as drought protection, and also concerns of water quality protection.
Hi, as Nick said, I'm Matt Naftali. I'm with JUDEC, principal hydrologist, and I'm going to start with just a really basic concept of what a groundwater basin is, and I think most of you probably know. Essentially, it's water that exists subsurface to the ground, and in Sigma, it's defined as water that exists between the particles of sand or other type of soils. And usually it's confined within some impermeable material like bedrock. This second bullet is a little bit silly because it basically says a basin is defined as a basin. So as we go through, hopefully we'll I think we have a slide later on that gives a little bit of a pictorial idea of what that is. So we have a series of maps here that show the area, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but there's some nuances that you should be aware of. To the east, you can see the Carpinteria groundwater basin and the Carpinteria jurisdiction, and over here to the west is Santa Barbara groundwater basin and service area. This is a little more of a close-up here, and the point of this slide is essentially to show you that there's three sort of sub-areas, storage areas for the Montecito Basin. There's one to the north, two in the center, and then number 3 is in the south. Those are generally designated by faults that have varying degrees of permeability. So this focuses on the east side of the basin, and I'm sorry, west side. This is Santa Barbara Basin and Montecito Basin. There's a couple of things of importance here. One is that there are areas within the Montecito Basin that are actually within Santa Barbara's service area, city of Santa Barbara, and also they have some infrastructure in these areas. And then alternatively, there's a part of the Montecito Basin that actually slops over into the Santa Barbara Basin. And then moving to the east side, we have Carpinteria Basin, and again, you can see that some of the Montecito Basin is actually within the Carpinteria service area, and so these create some challenges for the Sigma process, and we'll be talking a little bit about that as we go along. Oh, there it is. That's actually an area without groundwater. So as promised, we have a very basic picture of a cross-section here. And again, you probably are mostly familiar with this. It shows certain setup for aquifers. This is not specific to Montecito. If it was, you'd see the ocean on one side, which is unique to coastal basins. But You can see often aquifers are layered with different types of soil and different geology, and therefore they have different properties and yield different amounts of water to wells and things like that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the prioritization of groundwater basins, which was initially done by the Department of Water Resources in 2009, and that was part of the CASGEM program, which is California State Groundwater Elevation Monitoring. And that was a requirement for which they basically broke the basins in California up into priority levels, being high, medium, or low. And they define them in Bulletin 118, which is kind of the main document for groundwater in the state, and you can certainly look that up on the web. It's DWR's bulletin that talks about groundwater and their basins. So the Montecito Basin is currently designated as very low priority, and DWR is now going through the process of reassessing the priority levels that they initially assigned to the basins, not only because a certain amount of time has passed and things have changed, but because there's now more data available, and as we know, we've been through a drought which can affect the prioritization. And so we're working with DWR to make sure that they have the accurate data as they go through this reprioritization process. So what do they base that on, you're probably wondering, and it's a number of things. It's a kind of complicated formula that they don't always stick to, but population, projected growth, number of wells, and as many of you know, the number of wells in Montecito is not entirely known. Irrigated acreage, and also reliance on groundwater as a primary source. Then they take into account impacts that include things like using more groundwater than nature can sustain over a long period, land subsidence, when enough groundwater is removed from certain types of soils, they actually can collapse and the ground subsides. And then once that occurs, there's no ability to get that particular storage back. Water quality degradation and seawater intrusion. Of course, seawater intrusion is unique to coastal basins.
So the CASGEM program and the prioritization of groundwater basins was essentially the precursor to the SGMA process. Certainly SGMA was born out of a number of different interests, one of which being priority, and then we're at a stage of historic drought. So a little bit about just the SGMA, as we lovingly call it. So we'll move on to what are GSAs, these fun acronyms. Groundwater Sustainability Agencies. And groundwater sustainability agencies must manage groundwater in a manner that can be maintained during the planning and implementation horizon without causing undesirable results. So that sustainability planning horizon is from 2022 to 2042. So there's a 20-year planning horizon to come into a sustainability point. What is SGMA intended to do? It's intended to avoid undesirable results, those of which that are on this slide. So chronic lowering of groundwater levels, significant and unreasonable reduction in groundwater storage, significant and unreasonable degradation of water quality, land subsidence due to the collapsing of the aquifer pore, surface water depletions that are significant and unreasonable, and seawater intrusion. So these are the broad goals and aims of SGMA. Who does SGMA implicate? Participation is required, again, in all medium and high priority basins as born out of that CASGEM process. We've already discussed a little bit that Department of Water Resources is going through another reprioritization process. So it's possible that there'll be more basins that qualify under the medium and high priority category. And then there are some exceptions. So those entities that do not need to participate in SGMA include the federal government. So that includes military installations, federally recognized tribes, and then previously adjudicated basins. In this county, Santa Maria Groundwater Basin is an adjudicated basin, and the Glida Water District also has an adjudicated basin. So those basins are not required to go through the SGMA process. De minimis users is a bit of a question mark, and we'll go through that. How do de minimis users participate? Those entities are defined by the Department of Water Resources as people who use 2 acre feet a year of water or less for domestic purposes. SGMA further goes on to say that depending on the local needs of a groundwater sustainability agency, those de minimis users may be subject to SGMA, may be incorporated and may be regulated under SGMA. We'll move back to groundwater sustainability agencies. So again, we've kind of discussed that broadly. Yes? Per year. Per year. So your usage is per user, per water user. Yes. So if that's a parcel, then yes, it's one water user. So a water user would be one address that has one domestic use for that purpose. One parcel, one address that's using that acre feet. Yes. Yeah. Correct. So I'm actually going to just, as I stated at the beginning, happy to entertain questions, but I'd like to hold it to the actual question and comment period so that we can get through the presentation in a timely manner and then open it up to everybody's questions and comments, if that's okay. Thank you. So back to GSA again, local agencies are responsible for organizing and then also meeting the terms of SGMA, which is pulling together that groundwater sustainability plan. Local agencies are those agencies that have statutory authority over water resources, land use, or water management, any one of those or a combination thereof. And a single agency can form a GSA, or a combination of agencies can form a GSA in one portion of the basin or the entire basin. So it depends on the particular circumstances. What does a GSA do? GSA has a certain amount of tools at its disposal in order to ensure that sustainability goals of the basin are met. Those are requesting basin boundary modifications, establishing new subbasins, registration of wells, measurement of groundwater extractions, annual extraction reports, extraction limits, and funding the GSA to implement GSP projects and programs. So essentially, you're creating a local authority over groundwater resources. So it's a governmental agency, obviously. Turn it back over to Matt so that you're not bored with my voice.
So the other major part of SGMA is the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, and that is a technical document and planning document. It has to include description of the basin on a technical, physical basis. Has to include historical and projected water demands, areas of recharge, because you may want to protect those areas, or you may want to use them for supplemental water projects. It has to have milestones, so as you're moving towards sustainability for medium and high priority basins, that could be in 2040. You need to check in every 5 years and see that you're actually achieving what you need to achieve for sustainability. And then there has to be a monitoring and management plan along with that. Just for medium and high priority basins, it has to be approved by the Department of Water Resources no later than 2022. And as I mentioned, they have to be updated every 5 years, and those have to be approved by DWR. And then sustainable conditions as defined in that plan have to be actually achieved by 2042.
So funding the GSA and the GSP. The majority of funding is aimed at the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and the projects and programs that would flow from that plan to keep your groundwater basin in a sustainable condition. The costs for Montecito Groundwater Basin are as yet undefined. We're at the very beginning of this process. Obviously, this is the first workshop that we're having. We don't have all of the information that we need to make that determination, and we have a long road ahead, so not making any definition at this particular moment. Costs are also going to be very dependent on the scope of the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and the projects and programs that are included in that. And GSA and GSP may be funded by basin user assessment fees. Please skip a slide.
No, that's correct.
Okay.
So the next couple slides have to do with the timelines for the SGMA process, and we've been referring to some of those as we go. You can read this. I won't go through all of them, but again, this particular timeline applies to medium and high priority basins. Low priority basins are not held to a particular timeline. This timeline is more specific to Montecito, and what I'd like to point out here is that it's very tentative because we are at the beginning of the process. There's a lot of information to gather. It's unclear exactly how the process will unfold, but this is one potential timeline for Montecito.
So this all begs the question of why GSA and GSP for the Montecito Groundwater Basin. I know that Nick gave you a good overview of what the importance is, and we have put together a few of those items. Again, groundwater is a critical part of the water portfolio for the Montecito Water District, both on the water district level and on the individual water user level. It's a critical part of the drought response for the groundwater basin here and the Montecito Water District as a service provider. Why GSP and GSA? Because it provides for a local tool of control for a reliable water supply, local being local community. More important items that I believe prompted the board to move forward with this decision is that a lack of a proactive management regime really puts a burden on Montecito Water District, and a failure of the ability to serve water is obviously not anything that anybody wants to experience apart from the other undesirable results. We all know that the number of wells has increased dramatically throughout this past drought season, and so the ability to understand that dynamic is important. And unmonitored and Unregulated groundwater can really result in a local interference between wells and among wells. Surface water supplies are compromised at the statewide level as well as locally, as we all know, through driving down the 154 and seeing a shrinking puddle of Lake Kachuma. Thankfully, it's up now, but surface water clearly is in jeopardy. There's an increased demand overall, both statewide and locally. We can go into the design capacity of Kachuma and things of that nature. And there's sedimentation that has occurred in the lake over periods of time, and all of the above ground storage structures have really been diminished in terms of their ability to store groundwater based on sedimentation. And then there's climate change patterns that have also precipitated changes in reliance. So GSPs provide both the projects and the programs, again, those tools that allow the water district to have a better understanding and control over sustainability for the local basin.
So in regard to those supplies that are available for Montecito, this slide shows what the supplies are historically during average conditions and then during drought years. And it's relevant because you can see that groundwater plays a very important role for drought response. Over here in an average year, it was about 4% of the Montecito supply. And then during 2015 drought year, it went up to 16. Also notable here is that imported water under average conditions was 12% and then went up to 41%. And that is something that may not always be possible in future dry conditions. State Water Project is known to have some challenges with reliability that will worsen as time goes on. So that speaks to why managing groundwater is important in this area. This next slide is just an example of one well that's in storage unit number 1, and it shows a pretty significant decline during the current drought. This last measurement is the historic low, and that was taken in the fall of 2016. And so you can see that drought conditions definitely do affect the storage of your groundwater basin.
So that all-important tool of GSP will ultimately address the following issues: usable storage within the Montecito groundwater basin, establishment of a safe yield, the overall water quality that is taken out of the basin, and the interaction of the storage units. We can go back to the map that was presented at the beginning of the presentation that had sort of the sub-basins and the sub-units, but certainly we need further definition of that to understand how those interact. GSP will also address seawater intrusion, and again, those projects and programs to ensure the overall sustainability as well as feasibility and cost analyses for those projects and programs. So the goals of the GSP, as a responsible agency, the Montecito Water District has laid out these goals. Preservation of the local supply, respecting the overlying and other proprietary rights to the groundwater, acquire vetted and technical information related to the groundwater basin, the subunits, and interaction, as well as being able to implement those projects and programs, and protecting and increasing the sustainable yield of the basin, as well as enhancing the groundwater quality overall. So community engagement. Again, we're here to open this up and create dialogue. This is one of a series of public and stakeholder forums moving forward towards GSA formation. And we, DUDEC, have been working in other basins throughout Southern California. We have been working with GSAs that have promulgated different models of how to engage people and how to engage dialogue. We have organized advisory committees that sort of run in parallel process to the GSA formation. Those are generally made up of public and at-large members, as well as identified stakeholders to inform the Montecito Water District Board as they move forward on the process. And then in areas where GSAs have been formed, we have worked to create advisory committees that are standing committees to the groundwater sustainability agencies. The contact information is here on the slide and obviously also in your packets. And we're just about at the end of our presentation, but I wanted to let First District Supervisor Doss Williams, who wasn't able to address us before, come and say a few words.
Thank you. I always appreciate when a few people clap before you say something really unpopular. Now, I first I want to say that I really support the district moving ahead with the GSA formation. It's incredibly important when you are charged with water management for a region to ensure that a large part of that resource is actually sustainable. And so I'm here to basically say, if you hate this whole thing, you can blame it on me because I voted for it. We voted for this law, we enacted this law because the way that water has worked in the past will not continue to work. The way it's worked in the past is that areas have relied heavily on groundwater during droughts. And then when snowpack accumulated, we could be back reliant more on surface water. Well, that's not going to continue. That formula is dying, and it's dying because of warm storms. It is dying because more and more of our water that we receive as a state is in the form of rain and not of snow. And that means we are not going to be able to replenish groundwater supplies in the same way that traditionally has been possible. And it means we have to worry a lot more about the level of overdraft that has taken place in this basin and in other basins. And essentially the law structured it so that the most endangered basins went first. Good news is you're not one of the 12 most endangered in the state. The bad news is you're in the next cohort of how endangered the basin is. So we started this process months ago in Cuyama. So the First District Office has been through it. We're not experts in it, but we have been through it. And if you have any questions for us, we want to hear from you as well. So you can bombard them, but you can also bombard us. We're here to serve. I think they probably went over the basic thing to remember is they have to, the GSA has to be charged with creating a plan that will ensure 20-year sustainability of the basin. And that's difficult to do. And so if they don't do that, then the state takes control. That was some legislators' creative way to make everyone work together, right? Because nobody wants the state to take control of any basin. So I want to work with you and with the district and with the eventual GSA to help ensure sustainability of the basin. It won't be easy, because if it was easy, it would have been done before. But it is something that we'll have to work together to make possible. With that, hopefully that they'll blame me more than you guys, and we'll get this job done. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Supervisor Williams. So we'd like to open it up to questions and comments. This is your time to dialogue with all the folks who are here, both on the panel, at the board. And so I do believe that we have some speaker slips that were handed out, and we'd like to collect those. And if you still have them, if you want to raise your hand, we'll go around and collect them. read out your name, and you're welcome to. Yeah, we'd actually like you to fill out a slip because this is part of the public process. So ultimately, when we do file with the Department of Water Resources, we didn't get into all the nitty-gritty details. I think we hit you sufficiently with the drudgery of this. But there's a tedious process such that when the Department of Water Resources requires the Groundwater Sustainability Agency to file with them, that we have a good public record, that we have demonstrated good public outreach, that we have dialogue with the community, and this sort of sets the floor for that. So we'd like your comments written down so that we're ensuring that we get all of this on record and that we're accountable to you as well to answer those questions. So we would kindly ask you to fill them out. Thank you. So do we have any speaker slips at all? So thank you for that. Thanks for indulging me. And so I'm going to call folks up, and you're able to address all of us. Monty Cole. Monty will be followed by Peter Hunt.
Thank you. Monty Cole here. I'm a local designer, and I know some of you. Just wanted to say hello. What I've been doing is drawing up plans for harvesting creek water. When it floods, there's a way we can get water out of the local creeks. Even little Oak Creek over here can pull out 3 acres a day after a 1-inch rain. 3 acre feet of water per day. Montecito Creek, after a 1-inch rain, probably 10 acre feet a day we can pull out and still only touch about 10% of the flood water. So there are methods to get water when it rains hard and then store it later. The storage places have to be found, and so that's basically it. My designs and videos of exciting floods are at Cole Design Montecito. Thank you.
Thanks for that comment. I was going to point out that that's exactly the kind of project and option that could be looked at through the process of a GSP.
Okay, so Peter Hunt followed by Steve Carlson.
I just had a question. Is surface water we use that we purchase in order to refill the groundwater basin when we have a lowering of the groundwater basin? Can we buy surface water and fill it for storage underground?
Yeah, I mean, there needs to be a method whereby it's recharged back into the groundwater basin. So there needs to be some sort of a project that addresses that. But yes, it
The answer is yes, but it takes a construction project to do it.
Can we then purchase it through the Stakeholder project and refill our groundwater basin?
To my knowledge, Montecito does not have a large enough swale to do that yet, but that is something that other GSAs have proposed as part of their GSP, to use some water from some source, whether it's stormwater capture or purchased water or something else, to replenish it. But the problem with building that into the plan is you have to ensure that it's sustainable supply. And so my guess is that would not work if that was the hinge point of the plan. But if there was some other source that was more constant and you have the ability to sink it in the basin, yes.
So I think the overall academic model, frankly, for CEQA is local reliability. And so taking potential dubious surface water supplies, such as state water, and recharging into the basin while physically possible is probably not the necessary intent of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So capturing stormwater, for example, would be a really good use of recharge of the groundwater basin.
Hi, I'm Peter Hunt, property owner in Montecito. Also, I'm an architect, former president of the local chapter of the AIA. This year, we have the theme of water. One of the things I think this is a great idea. The law of supply and demand. I don't think it's been repealed, and of course, with the amount of groundwater there's so much from year to year. But I understand. I've heard this a lot in professional groups, that there's a new state law that says everybody in the state of California can build a second unit legally on their property, and that this state law overrides all local laws. And I find this, I see someone frowning, and I thought this is unusual based upon my experience and my education. And apparently it overrides a U.S. law as well. But what it means is these people in Sacramento have passed this law. I could be wrong. I hope I am wrong. But this is, and I heard it again yesterday in our meeting, which means, there are building permits. I just got a call today. I want to put a little home on my 5-acre parcel that happens to be up in Mission Canyon. And the state law overrides all local laws. But as I understood it when I was back in architecture school, the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution says that local laws are cultural laws and that you can make your own local laws. And that would be, say, sustainability of the groundwater basin here. And to say, well, then we only have so much water, therefore you can only have so many water meters or something like that. So it seems to be, to me, supply and demand, that apparently the demand in the state of California is so great that we have to legislate that we're going to have more housing units. And yet the law of supply would say there's only so much water. And it seems to me that there's a reconciliation here. And I'm curious, and I thought you might be curious as well. Maybe some of you have answers. I mean, Mr. Williams, I don't know if you voted for that bill, but apparently it was signed by the governor last year. But how does that, I'm curious. And what is that going to, if we, okay, that's one subject. And I'll just real briefly say the other one. There's a state law that says every time you do a project on your parcel, when the project's over a certain size, you have to capture the stormwater on your parcel. And the reason is that there could be polluted water on your parcel, and we want it to have a biofilter so their natural bacteria will clean that water before it ends into the public right-of-way. However, what is the percentage of the land that's in the public right-of-way? Is that 15%, 20%? I don't know. But there's where the drippings comes off of the, the exhaust pipe and off the crankcase. Or people that decide to eat out in the public right-of-way and then they leave their food there. I happen to work downtown. I see that a lot. That to me is polluted water, and yet that water is not captured by the public entities. And then as a result, it could be filtered in gutters and go into the groundwater basin rather than running into the streams and running into the ocean. So it's another one of those questions that we're looking at in terms of water quality, water storage, water capture, and all of those things. And I think there are things that are relevant to, although maybe ancillary to what's going on here, there's still, it involves supply and demand. And thank you much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt. So I imagine, Steve, was that you that made the comment about surface water? Okay, so we have Ann followed by Chaz Newman.
Good evening. I'm Ann Price. I'm at La Casa de Maria. And so 2 quick questions. Supervisor Williams mentioned that the state will take over if we don't manage this ourselves. But the question I had is, if we are considered a low priority basin, is that still the case?
No. So right now, low and very low priority basins are not targeted. That's the current process. High and medium, that's a compulsory process. And those filing deadlines I mentioned for GSA formation by June 30th of 2017, and then plan formation in overdrafted basins by 2020 and high and medium in 2022. Those are compulsory processes. At this point, the very low priority basins are not required to meet those deadlines, and so state intervention is unlikely at this time.
So are we thinking that with the reprioritization that we might go up in priority? Is that part of why we're addressing this?
I don't know that we can make sort of any prognostication right now on what the priority level is going to be. I think certainly there's been a lot of circumstantial changes between 2009 and now, and so we'll take that into consideration.
And then my second question is the percents that were up there for groundwater use. Do they represent just the Montecito Water District groundwater wells themselves, or also private wells? Were the groundwater percents that were on the charts, the 4% and then the 14%, do they represent just the Montecito Water District wells themselves, the groundwater wells, or do they also represent private groundwater wells?
It represents just Montecito Water District's wells, yes.
So private is in addition to that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the groundwater basin is the groundwater basin per Bulletin 118. There hasn't been any basin boundary modification or adjustment, so I don't think that it's in the scope to redefine the basin. That is the 118 basin. That is the groundwater basin per definition, and yes, that would be coterminous with the jurisdictional boundaries of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency. I don't think that we're making any decisions right now on anything. I don't think we're there, but I'll let the board opine on that. Good question. I'm not going to answer it, though. That's for the board to answer. Yeah, maybe. Would you want to have that question answered first, Bob, and then you can come up and address the groundwater basin aspect of it? Okay. Do you all want to opine on that? Sam? I mean, there's definitely methodologies and formulas that can be employed. Certainly, just as DWR did in assigning their prioritization, there are wells that are being monitored. Obviously, the district wells are being monitored, and there's other methodologies in place in order to get a good understanding of what's happening in the basin. It's not, the ideal, but go ahead, Dick, please.
Yeah. There has been talk and some speculation concerning how many wells are there really in Montecito. We have to find out. I mean, there's some indications, there's some that go back long before records were kept, and most of the new ones should be able to be found. The next question is, and exactly what Charles said, there's been some talk at some point, and we don't know when that may be, but there is a probability that there will be a requirement to have the amount of water taken out from everyone's well monitored and reported periodically. That hasn't happened, but realistically, it probably will have to happen. And then the question is, if you've all seen pictures of what's gone on in other parts of the state where too much water comes out and the ground subsides and some of it's down 3 and 4 and 5 feet and it doesn't come back up. We can't let that happen here. And at some point, assuming that we have a reasonable method of keeping track of how much water is taken from the wells, then you get into the question as to, can that be regulated, that you're taking too much water and you can't take that much water again. And we've had conversations concerning, are there going to be lawsuits filed that say, you know, for umpteen hundred years, that well's been on my property and no one said I can't take as much water as I want to take. Well, then the state comes in and the state says, hey, all the groundwater belongs to the state and we have control over it. And those are all questions that have to be answered, and that's why this is in the beginning stage, and we're trying to find out what makes sense, what will keep the situation such that for a 20-year period, we know that if we're in a long-term drought, and we have to put regulations on because we have to be sure we have sufficient water to cover the community. We were at meetings within the last week when they talked about comes the big earthquake, and the tunnel that brings water in from Kachuma is destroyed, or the aquifer that brings water from the Sacramento area down, and it's destroyed. How much water is there going to be? And there's plans that are going in effect that'll say that if we have water and Carpinteria doesn't, that we'll be able to give water to Carpinteria, or vice versa, and the same with the city, and the same with Goleta. All of this is long-term planning, trying to do just what it says, make the water situation sustainable so that if problems do occur, no one's going to get badly hurt.
Very erudite. Thank you, Director Shakowitz. So I'm going to call Bob McDonald up. Bob McDonald is the General Manager of the Carpinteria Valley Water District, and as you can see, there are some unique circumstances between the Carpinteria Groundwater Basin and the Montecito Groundwater Basin. Did you want to?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I really just want to address the point that Mr. Newman brings up about the maybe it's not apparent, or maybe it is apparent that I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, so it may be apparent or it may not be apparent, but you know, these depictions of the groundwater basin were developed in 2003 by DWR from a 10,000 foot level. They really didn't look very closely at where the actual boundaries were, so they drew them in from documents and whatnot, and so in many places, you know, they crossed jurisdictional boundaries. Like in this case, you can see they're showing part of Toro Canyon subbasin in Carpinteria. In order to fix that, because they didn't ever contemplate in 2003 that we would be where we are now trying to manage groundwater basins. In order to fix that, DWR has put together a process called the the Basin Boundary Modification Process, and that's coming up in 2018. And we, Carpinteria Valley Water District, have been in talks with Montecito to figure out how we do that. So the question, I think, is, are there going to be these overlapping jurisdictional problems about management of the basin? And the process is there, and we're intending to follow that process and get these basins to match the jurisdictional line so that we're not stepping on each other when we're trying to manage different basins across the coast. So.
Thank you, Bob. Ted Thielman, followed by Sybil Rosen.
I just have a couple of questions, really. One of them is what we talked about, the jurisdictional requirement to move from a low priority to a higher priority, but what is the physical actual, I know it seems like it's a administrative thing rather than some kind of a reality thing of why are we in a low priority at this point, and why would we want to move into the next level up, which would require these things. One of the reasons that I asked the question is when we built our house in bought the property in 89, built the house in 91. I had to put a well in because the Montecito Water District would not sell me a water meter. So we spent, several tens of thousands of dollars to have the well drilled, equipment installed, a whole piping system for that. And that worked for a while until about 10 or so years later, when the water quality that we were getting out of the well started to become very hostile to piping and things in the house. So at that point, Montecito Water District was very happy to sell me a water meter at that point. And that was, again, tens of thousands of dollars, and having to foot the bill for bringing a water line that they wouldn't extend the main far enough to get to us. We had to go up the street to get it. Montecito Water District didn't want to have anything to do with that. So then we were connected up with that. And we're paying the rates for that. We're fine. And now we conserve as much water as we can, but the rates keep going up because of the drought. Those are all realities. But I guess where I'm going with it is, at what point is it going to be that we're going to need to pay for the water that we had to develop the entire infrastructure for in order to get the groundwater to reduce our municipal water that we need to do. I don't think I'm the only one that's in this situation, and so I would like to suggest that there be some kind of grandfather if it starts to look like there's going to be a rate structure or something for using the water that is coming out of the infrastructure that we put in or whatever. Can there be some kind of grandfather clause for those people that did initially intend to use the water for domestic use and develop our lives around it for the last 25 years, and then all of a sudden there's income generation for Montecito Water District. So that's my question.
Do you want to start with the priority aspect of it, or?
Well, in regard to the prioritization process, that is something that the state conducts on all the basins, and they're going to be doing that periodically in conjunction with basin boundary modifications that Mr. McDonald mentioned. It's something that since they're doing it, I think the idea is to make sure that they're basing it on realistic information and accurate data. And so it's not really a matter of desired prioritization, it's just a matter of making sure that it's accurate.
I've had a lot of years to suddenly come to the realization that the reason we have laws is because most people find ways to break them. And I think there's a lot of confusion about groundwater and who gets it, and this whole attitude about I can use what I want. I'm very concerned about the lack of education. I'm hoping that that's all it is a lack of education, that people realize what they're doing with all these private wells, and it's mine. It's not, it's ours. And so I think there's a big piece of this that has to be education about the wells and regulating and coming forward and people saying we're all in this together. And I think that there is a reason why there's a lot of distrust, because over time there have been problems not only in our area, but all over the country. But they don't trust the people that made these decisions. I had a lot to appreciate when Mr. Hunt spoke about we're making a decision to build more houses, to build more, and then where do we get the water? So I think that we have to get our story straight, and we have to make decisions that are going to be wise and protect all of us for a very long time. So going forward in this, I think we need to know a lot more about the wells, because people are depending on those in Montecito.
I'm our representative, the district's representative to the Joint Powers Insurance Agency, which is a statewide insurance agency of all the water districts. And at one of the recent meetings, the very issues that you all have been talking about was discussed in detail.
Right.
Is there going to be 2 or 3 suits in every district, or are there going to be 5 or 6 around the state? No one knows. I mean, there's just a lot of unanswered questions.
And people are already figuring out how they can get around this.
This is the question that the water districts had. What's the best way to handle it? And honestly, no one knows for sure until those suits are filed and heard and decided. I mean, that's where it is, because if just what the gentleman said, if he has his own well that he put in, can we come in and say, wait a minute, you've been taking this much water out, now you can only take half as much out? Some court, whether it's the Court of Appeals or the California Supreme Court, is going to come down and say, here's what the rules are. And until they're laid out, we're all playing in a very, very gray area.
I would just like to say that I would hope that people would have a higher sense of what is good for the country, what is good for our community, as opposed to what's good for them. That's where the lawsuits come from, because people don't think that way. So good luck. Thank you for trying.
Thank you. Corey Heyman, followed by Theodore Klein.
Good evening. I think Mr. Newman's question may have answered, or Ms. Dudek may have, Ms. Jane may have answered the question I had by Mr. Newman in terms of the boundaries. But I do have a further question. On slide 30, there's a discussion in 2018 about reprioritization of the basin, and I think in a prior slide, discussion about boundary modifications. So, and there's also a memo that I just pulled up today that Dudek prepared for Mr. Turner with respect to reprioritization of the groundwater basin to a medium priority. So my question is, other than the Carpinteria potential boundary adjustments, are there any plans to further adjust the boundaries of the basin? That's my first question. And then my second question is there a current effort to reprioritize our basin, and who's directing that effort?
Thank you. So the Department of Water Resources has initiated the prioritization process. So it's a state process of reprioritization. And I believe the district is just gathering information to ensure that correct information is being used. Related to the basin boundary modification, that is another state-initiated process. There was a discussion between Carpinteria and Montecito in 2016 about adjusting those basin boundaries related to Toro Canyon. That sort of assertion of basin boundary modification was not ultimately supported by the Department of Conservation. So we're in dialogue. Montecito and Carpinteria Valley Water District are in dialogue right now to that 2018 deadline related to the jurisdictional boundary of the Montecito Water District and the Carpinteria Valley Water District, and then the actual groundwater basin areas. Does that answer your question? Are there any other plans for boundary? Not that I'm aware of. Anybody else? Okay. Yeah. So then Theodore is going to address us, and then Mr. Rick Jansen, followed by Mark Bishop.
I have
two lots in Innisbrook, in the Innisbrook development, and the acreage contiguous between Innisbrook and the Valley Club. When the drought hit and the water allocations were promulgated by the district, at least 5 of my neighbors installed water tanks to supplement their irrigation without permits. Now, in order for the Innisbrook development to occur, all the groundwater was dedicated to the Montecito Water District, and the Montecito Water District operates 2 large wells at the foot of Innisbrook on San Leandro. The issue was, of course, where was the water coming from in order to supply the water tanks. And the matter of the water tanks went all the way to the Coastal Commission. And the Coastal Commission determined that any development, any new development, has to be accommodated by the existing services, so that if the Montecito Water District cannot provide enough water, for example, to irrigate 3 acres of lawn, that water cannot be brought in from outside. The average capacity of these water tanks range from about 5,000 gallons to 10,000 gallons. Now, my pool is 14,000 gallons, so they're pretty large. The Coastal Commission determined that the water that was being imported to my one neighbor came from Lake Castaic in Los Angeles County, and that water affected the coastal aquifers, even though it was in Lake Castaic in Los Angeles County. Now, the question I have, of course, is where does the supplemental water come from that is used in these water trucks? And, of course, the Coastal Commission determined that none of these water tanks can be permitted in Montecito, so all of them, unpermitted or unpermittable. Now, the question that I have now is, of course, we know which water companies provide these services by means of water trucks. They're A1, Marburg, and Progressive Tree Care. I know for a fact that one of my neighbors with these pirated water tanks has been receiving water from a private operator in Carpinteria. So if, as the Coastal Commission has determined, all subterraneous water is contiguous in terms of its aquifers, the question that I have is, where is the water coming from that is being used to fill new pools that are now being permitted by the county? The water has to come from somewhere, and since it seems, of course, that the allotments are insufficient to fill these new pools, why is the county continuing to permit new pools if the Coastal Commission has determined that if the existing services are insufficient to provide for new development, these pools are continuously being permitted by the county? Maybe Das Williams can answer that question.
Thank you, Ted, and I appreciate your vigilance of water. I think the representative from Carpinteria Valley Water District will probably tell you that too much of that trucked-in water is coming illegally from Carpinteria, and that they've had to, even his predecessors, who of his time following water trucks, because essentially, because there's some folks who can pay for it here, people are stealing from our neighbors in Carpinteria, and that's very wrong in my view. What is and can the county do about it? Well, the county has obviously limited jurisdiction on water, but we do permit land uses, as you mentioned. And the first action that I took as supervisor is to name new members of the Planning Commission and the Montecito Board of Architectural Review, with the primary criteria that I used, because there was a lot of great applicants. This community has some really talented people. But the litmus test, I put aside the people I like the most. I put aside the ones that in some cases had some additional expertise on other matters, and I concentrated on the ones who were going to be most vigilant about water hawks, that were going to be most vigilant on, and you might even say draconian, on watching over our water supplies. And that, the discretionary ones are wells in the coastal zone, which are discretionary in the county, the size of pools and other amenities, what type of landscaping is approved, and whether there is water trucking or not. And it is my belief that the MBAR and the MPC will have a much higher standard in all of these matters in regards to water use.
Well, my question is, why is the county continuing to permit new pools in Montecito when there is clearly not enough water in the allocation, not the allocation of pools?
I think that most applicants will be held to a tougher standard for approving such things. I didn't say that they would not be able to provide them under any circumstances. And I think what they're going to have to do is explain to the design review firm and to the MPC where they're going to get the water, and how they can prevent it from being a water problem. The only other thing that the county could do, which the district brought forward before, which is to be, say, a moratorium on new wells. That is something that the county could do. It has not chosen to do that in the past. But I'm definitely a believer that taking some actions earlier, like knowing how much water we're taking out of the basin versus how much is going in, would make any crisis later on less painful. And so if people believe that it's better than taking draconian measures later on to just not permit new wells for a little while, well, they should tell us, because the county does have the ability to do that.
Well, where is the water coming from in order to fill the new pools?
The answer is, Ted, for the most part, we don't know. We know too much of it's coming from illegal sources.
They buy it from Montecito and they pay more than their allocation. They pay $50
Okay, whoa. We're going to allow Mr. Cohen to answer that question.
You may have read last year where Cayugas went after a pretty well-known individual for using Cayugas water to water his avocado orchard. That gentleman lives in Hidden Valley. Cayugas has an ordinance that says you can't use Cayugas water outside of Cayugas' boundaries. Hidden Valley is not within Cayugas' boundaries. So for Cayugas to successfully sue that gentleman, they had to perform investigations. They had to catch the water truck from its source, hook it up to a hydrant within Cayugas' boundaries, and trucking that water. And they had to do that more than once. They had to do that several times. So the question, that's $1 million question, where the water's coming from. Because chances are it's being stolen. Chances are it's being hooked up, a water truck is hooking up to a hydrant or some construction site, and that's where the water's coming from. Montecito Water District doesn't have any control of the water trucks going up and down these streets.
Oh, I understand that. But surely it would be easier just to put a moratorium on new pools until the water restriction.
Montecito Water District has asked the county to put a moratorium on wells, not just pools. And Montecito has an ordinance in place that says you can't go to Montecito water. But there are people that don't care about the penalties, that are willing to pay them, that will use beyond their allocation and pay their water bill every month without ever filing an appeal because they used in excess of their allocation by mistake or something to that effect. They just don't care.
Thank you. That was a lively discussion. I do want to remind everyone that this is being taped, and in order for all of everybody's good comments and thoughts to be captured, we would request that you please use the microphone so that for posterity that everyone is heard. So Mr. Jansen, followed by Mr. Bishop, please.
Mine are mostly just questions. So we've talked about sustainability, but no one has defined sustainability. And so the whole thing depends upon somebody's judgment of what's sustainable. So is there a good definition of sustainable that we all can understand?
Not at present, because the sustainability goal of the basin is defined by the technical information. So every basin has its own sustainability point.
That's dodging the question part. It is dodging the question because there has to be a definition of what sustainability is in the legislation. How it's implemented in Montecito may be a technical question, but what does it mean? Does it mean it can never drop below the average? Does it have to be built up? You know, what does sustainable mean? And now I'm hearing that you can't import water, so is sustainable built? What are the rules? You're going to tell us that we're building this thing, and you're not telling us what we're trying to accomplish. So other than sustainability, sounds nice.
So the details of sustainability have to be defined through the process of studying the basin and completing a GSP. However, the state, as we showed on a slide, has definitions that have to do with the absence of certain negative effects, including seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and those types of things. So there's sort of a guideline that you go into the process with in order to come up with sustainability goals that are appropriate for your particular basin.
So
I know this sounds amorphous, but the sustainable, well, it's a policy. And so there's not a one-size-fits-all, and not every single basin is created equally. So the process that one goes through to define that sustainability is really informed by the technical information that goes into the process. So the technical data will generate the sustainability point for the basin over a certain set of parameters: time horizon, number of wells, particular uses within the basin. It's a process. It's not one punctuated point.
Yeah, okay. No offense, but that's just bureaucratic talk. So my next question is, or my statement, the reason we don't have any facts about metering wells and or water rights is because that's all to be adjudicated. No one knows whether this legislation even will work, because if the courts say you own your water rights, this thing gets pulled apart. If the court says you can't, it's unreasonable search and seizure to force me to monitor my water, this falls apart. You can't monitor it. Okay, so I assume that that's correct. That's why we're not getting an answer on those two issues.
Well, the adjudication process has largely changed under the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. There's a possibility to file quiet title, but it's not the same old adjudication process as it was, 5 years ago.
No, but I saw on one slide, but it got skipped over, that there was no metering and there was no violation of water rights. It got skipped, but I thought I saw that slide. Is that correct?
According to Sigma.
I don't. It was skipped over so fast I couldn't possibly tell you. I don't want to waste everybody's time trying to find it, but so those were my, and I guess it really is a legal question we just don't know the answer to. Is that correct? I'm getting a head nod, but no one is saying it out loud.
Framework of the law was developed to get people talking, dialoguing, figuring out the priorities, coming to an agreement on how are we going to make this basin sustainable over the next 20 years.
Yeah, but it's just, it's really hard to know when you don't know what one man's definition or one woman's definition of sustainable is versus somebody else's, but okay. And the last question I have is this idea of changing the water boundaries for a basin based upon matching Carpinteria versus Montecito. Aren't there natural boundaries on water basins? I mean, they're not just lines drawn on a map. They're where fault lines are, et cetera. So if there's really one basin and it's really connected, Carpinteria and Montecito share the same basin, how can you separate it?
Well, so I think what we were alluding to earlier is that back in 2003, the Department of Water Resources had less technical data than they do now, and a less sophisticated instrumentation to draw those boundaries. So as we have gone through the process and refined down, yes, there obviously are faults and other geological formations, but part of the process of going through a GSA and a GSP are really to harden up those positions and define those. There are points at which the basins do converge, obviously, but then there's the jurisdictional boundaries. Where do the jurisdictions overlie one another? So the conversation that we were having in that Toro Canyon area is what's the service area boundary and what's the actual true geological connection? Is there a recharge area? Are they, is there transmissivity? I think we have to do a little bit more information to determine, what those areas are.
Okay, so that's why the boundary just doesn't necessarily match the service boundary. Okay, and it probably shouldn't, but okay, thank you.
Excuse me, I'd like to add to your point on sustainability. And I think it relates more to not creating an undesirable results from the plan that emerges. We don't even know what the plan is yet. Frankly, we don't know how many wells there are in Montecito. There's a reference on one of the slides to de minimis volume of 2 acre-feet per well. We don't know how many of those there are, and I don't know how you can get there. To Charles' point, we need to have meters on wells to know that. You can't guess on how many de minimis wells are out there. I've heard as many as 500 to 700 wells in Montecito. I've also heard there's no groundwater in Montecito, but everybody knows that there's a lot of groundwater. So we want to get to the point where there's no undesirable result. In the last 2 or 3 years, I've heard 200 new wells were drilled. What impact does that have on sustainability? Nobody really knows. I think until you start measuring and getting solid data and knowing even where the wells are, we don't have a map that shows all these private wells. It's not like the district wants to take over groundwater ownership. It's a private it's a public resource, but it's also a property right. People have the wells, they're using the water. I think it's good for Montecito generally to make sure they're sustainable and that they continue to pump those wells. I know I didn't answer your question, but I feel better about it.
Mr. Bishop, followed by Mr. Price.
Thanks very much. I appreciate you guys taking all this stuff on. This is a lot of work for you. It's probably more than you anticipated. What is DUDEC?
What's a name? Check. Derivation. DUDEC is an engineering and environmental firm. We're local here to Santa Barbara. We have a number of offices throughout the state of California, one in Honolulu and one in Portland, but we are primarily a water and wastewater engineering firm with a number of environmental specialties.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So I'm a homeowner here. I just have some educational questions because I don't really know the answers. And I know that it sounded like this is kind of a preliminary meeting to say that you're going to look into all this stuff and come up with a plan, and you don't have any answers yet. But I'd just kind of like to know, as a homeowner, I'd just kind of like somebody to stand up and give a couple of little comments about a few issues. You mentioned saltwater intrusion. Is that something that people anticipate is a problem in Montecito that is increasing dramatically, or not really? And is that something that would reverse with the rain coming back, or does that never reverse once it's come in more? Can someone answer that one?
As the wells are close to the ocean, the question becomes, as you draw the wells down and you've got the pressure of the water in the ocean, is there going to be saltwater intrusion? In other places in the state, Pismo Beach has bad saltwater infusion right now. That's my understanding. Through Central Coast Water, they were trying to get more water to pump into the ground to push it out and to stop it from happening. So that once it starts, you've got a serious problem, because are you going to lose, if we have 3 main aquifers, are you going to lose one of the whole aquifers? So it's a consideration that has to be looked at and monitored closely.
Oh, that's great. I was just wondering if you have a sense of whether you seem to believe it's happening a lot more recently, or it's a problem somewhere else that you don't want it to happen here. So you have not really seen it or anticipate that it's really happening at this moment. Is that right?
I'm aware that there is some saltwater intrusion in Santa Barbara. They pumped some wells near the ocean, and I don't know to what extent, how far inland it's gone. In the Oxnard Plain, there's a lot of saltwater intrusion. I'm not aware of any in Montecito, but it's another one of those I don't know questions.
Okay. And then there was something on here about 2000.
Can I just
go ahead.
add to that? There's been a lot of historic study of the basin, and that's not to say that current conditions are known precisely, but I believe there is evidence of some saltwater intrusion in the coastal aquifer here in Montecito.
When you say coastal aquifer, does that mean like within a block of the beach, or does that mean going in for some ways?
I don't know the answer to that. How far depends on climate and a number of other factors.
Okay. All right. That's great. Thank you. There was a thing in there that said 2022 was when the implementation starts. Does that mean that you wouldn't do anything except for kind of collect information and come up with a plan before then, or could people be required to put on meters by then, for example, or would there be possibility of any restrictions of use before then, or is that the first date when you anticipate there would be any kind of action at all that would be required for homeowners?
Here.
I guess the question there is one based on circumstances. Tell me whether we'll be in a drought between now and then, and I think that'll determine a lot of what we may have to do. I mean, the whole object of our board here is to try and get as much water as we can to sustain the people, certainly in their health and welfare within Montecito. Beyond that, if we don't have the water, then we've got to start cobbling together a plan to at least be able to make the amount of water that we're providing now sustainable. And we're lucky this year we've had some rain, but if it doesn't rain like it hasn't before, we've got to create a whole new matrix.
So you could take some actions to restrict homeowners in some ways if needed, but that's separate from, this is kind of a state-dictated planning process that you have to have something by 2022 where the implementation starts. Is that right?
That's my
but you could do
understanding.
stuff
I'll leave the
before.
technical legal details to our counsel. You can probably fill those in.
And then you mentioned there's a list of a whole bunch of issues. Is it the general view that Montecito well users are already using too much water, taking too much water out of the ground, or is there something that you really have no idea and you have to get the information before, or is there, or do you already know the answer and you just need to collect it to prove it?
We don't know the entire answer, but we have had people that have come to us and said our wells are dry now and they want to use more water. So the problem is there. Wells are running dry that have been in existence for a long time, and they're in various areas. And if it keeps up unmonitored and with everyone drawing as much as they can, are they all going to go dry? And we can't let that happen.
Okay, that's great. All right, and my last one was to discuss water rights issues, but it doesn't sound like you guys really... Well, I guess my only question on that is, aren't there already a bunch of precedents in the rest of the state on water rights issues? It seems like this is like the key issue of every farmer in the whole state. Where do you get the water from? It doesn't seem like Montecito is the first place that this would come up, that you can't find precedents to answer the questions about whether the homeowners have water rights or not. Anyone want to comment on that?
Huh.
I'm not sure there's an easy answer to that. However, in one of the earlier comments about what's sustainable and what's not, California is so far behind the times with respect to regulating groundwater. It's been like the Wild West. For instance, in Paso Robles, where so many people have vineyards, there are wealthier landowners and not so wealthy landowners with vineyards. Some of the wealthier owners were able to afford to take their wells that they had and drill deeper and spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and essentially drive their neighbors to sell their properties because they were using all the groundwater and none of it was going down to their neighbors' properties. So the gentleman that made the comment about what's sustainable and the courts are going to rip this apart, and yes, the legislature makes laws. Groundwater law regulation in California is long, long, long overdue. It's arriving, and then it's going to be interpreted in California courts. And it's going to take some time, and there's going to be some growing pains with it. There's no doubt about any of this. But if we don't start somewhere, then we're missing a big opportunity. And I think actually the board is to be commended for stepping up in this situation where they know it's going to be a mess. They're already taking heat on a number of other topics, and yet they know in their heart of hearts that it's the right thing to do. Somebody needs to take control over groundwater in Montecito, or there won't be much, if any. Because one of the more truer words or sentences that was uttered tonight is that once an aquifer collapses, it doesn't recharge. And once you drain it, it's a lost resource and it's lost forever. So we need to abide by the process. And you might also ask why, if we're such a low priority basin, is the district even attempting to do this? And the answer is that the state encourages low priority basins to do this, because a low priority basin just means that it's not that big, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't be regulated, it shouldn't be monitored, and it shouldn't be there for everybody that needs it. And that's basically all that's trying to happen. And I've spoken enough.
Thank you, Bob. Mr. Johnson, followed by Mr. Hunt. Oh, I'm sorry. Ms. Johnson, I'm sorry.
Thank you. I'm Doreen Lee Johnson, and I want to thank the Montecito Water District for putting this on today. I do have a question regarding the wells. I know that you're looking into the wells. One thing that I'm concerned about is really the health and safety of the wells and how they are maintained, because I think there are some issues that could probably happen with wells. So I like the idea of Supervisor making an idea of possibly putting a moratorium on wells until some decisions are made. But I am concerned about the maintenance of wells and when you look into how many there are, to possibly come up with some kind of a plan as well. Okay, for safety and health and safety issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hunt, followed by Mr. Moran.
There was an issue brought up earlier about sustainability and groundwater, and I just wanted to say, so I'm a generalist as an architect, and these guys are experts up here, and I'm sure they know the answer to this, but we're talking, and they're not talking so much, but so groundwater wells, was 150 foot deep? Is it 300 feet? Is it 500 feet deep? If your well was deeper, would there be more groundwater? How do you measure a groundwater basin? People were saying, well, where are the aquifers? And it appears on some of these maps that they appear to be more like political boundaries than they do boundaries of an actual aquifer or water basin. And that's, I'm guessing, because in certain areas you've measured and you know where the basin is, where the aquifer is. And in other areas they haven't measured. And so there are aquifers and there are aquitards. And when you have a lot of clay, water can't move through clay, because that's, of course, for 5,000 years they've been making vessels out of clay to hold water for that very reason. But there was a new advancement about 10 years ago. I'm sure you've all heard about it. It was called nanotechnology, where they took electrically charged particles and they could put them in a liquid, and with that radio charge, you could then send the radio charged particle in water miles and miles away, and with the radio know where the charge was. And so the first industry that picked that up, of course, was the petrochemical industry, and they immediately went down into the dry wells in Texas and Oklahoma, and what was ostensibly a dry well, they discovered, my gosh, if we keep pumping and forcing there, we can find out that there are caverns that there's more oil in. And this industry, you all know it, is called the fracking industry. And that's, in effect, how they were able to, there was this glut of oil that came out of this country that we simply didn't know was there. Now, how expensive is that? Whether the little Montecito Water District could afford to do that, would they want to? There's a whole bad rap on fracking. I mean, I guess it causes earthquakes or something. In Oklahoma, these are apparently very small earthquakes, but it is possible. I'm not saying it is, don't get me wrong, but I'm saying it is possible that the groundwater basin is greater, but nonetheless, what is sustainable? And how much does it cost? Because there's environmental sustainability and there's fiscal sustainability. And right now, I mean, I read the information, and I was in the Montecito Journal, but more money is being spent than is being taken in, and where do you get this money? So I'm just trying to add to the dialogue. But these guys, these people, they know. I'm just a generalist. They're experts.
Thank you, Mr. Moran.
Good evening. When will you guys have the data to assess the basin and the priority of the basin? And then subsequent, when will you submit to the state to have the priority of the basin readjusted, if the data's in that shows that?
Yeah, so there's no submittal process. The Department of Water Resources is going through an independent process. There's no request for information from any district statewide. It's a statewide process. Department of Water Resources is providing the reprioritization. So there's no solicitation of information.
So when would we know that the basin's reprioritized so that then you guys could form a GSA?
So, well, I think there's two things. I don't know that anybody's waiting for reprioritization to begin the process of GSA formation. The Department of Water Resources, if you want to pull up that timeline slide, is going through their process and will come back with their draft suggestions on reprioritization somewhere in summer of 2018.
June of 2018, we would
20
know.
2017, sorry.
June of this year,
Yeah.
we'll know what the redetermination of the priority basin is. And what data set is that based on?
That's based on the state data set that they have. Yeah.
So that's a larger data set than what they used in the Bulletin 118?
That's basin boundaries, yeah.
Okay.
So I don't have any more speaker slips. Does anybody wish to speak on any other matter related to this presentation? Is it? Well, I invite you to come up, please.
Yeah, my name's Lawrence Price. I'm a water well operator. I used to work for the city of Santa Barbara. I operate a lot of private, shared, mutual wells, and also work with the municipalities, most of these people here. The sustainable growth concept within the sustainability thing. One of the things that the state, and I'm not a lawyer, okay, but maybe Doss or somebody else does know this, but the state legislation has mandated certain amount of growth and that a community must have to receive funds. Am I accurate?
I think you're speaking of the regional housing insurance.
Sorry. Yeah.
I think you're referring to the regional housing needs assessment process, which has been going on for about 20 years, a little before my time, and it does not require growth in communities, but it requires zoning for population growth. Now, I think because these kind of issues have come in a couple times, I do want to tell you that in the city of Santa Barbara, the additional growth that has happened in the city of Santa Barbara and housing projects have used less water with more people. So growth should always be an issue that you do wisely, but in the cases of the city of Santa Barbara, when I was a council member there, those projects, the new projects that house more people used less water than the projects that had fewer people beforehand. So those aren't always equated.
Is there some funding that comes from the state for that?
There are hammers for any jurisdiction that does not do a housing element every 5 years that's certified by the state, and that's how the RENA process is enforced.
So I'm hoping that in the water boards here and DUDEC's purview, that they're looking at the increased demands of sustainability, that effect in there. Water, energy use is always increasing. We would be smart to pay attention to what the Europeans are doing. They're reusing water. Mr. Cole spoke earlier about groundwater, local groundwater harvesting. That has to be done within the blessings of Fish and Game, of course, because you're taking from water courses. But it's a good idea. It's used a lot in the LA Basin. I don't know if the Montecito district has areas that it could consider something like that, but it could be on the long-term horizon, possibly as an idea. The fiery question that I see is, how do you determine what is historical use and what is allocated to somebody that may not be metering their water. They don't know how much they use. You know, we all drive a vehicle or conveyance, and we watch the fuel meter, but we don't watch the water meter. I run a lot of different wells for the state, for the county, for I've worked with a lot of the agencies here. But one of the things that happens is with private wells, there's no interaction per se with a local agency, okay? I believe that's the intention of what this is about. The other point is I also have operated wells where there is no meter and people do not know how much water they're using. Now that's not just Montecito, that's Santa Barbara, that's Goleta, that's all over. Carpinteria, I've seen it every place, okay? People historically haven't needed to do that. We have to move into a time when we realize that energy and water is really changing. It's really changing. We have these historical droughts and then these wet years, and they keep amplifying, okay? So I'm not a hydrogeologist, but some of us can figure that one out. The thing in the allocations, okay? You determine it's 2 acre-feet per address. Domestic residents, if they have, I forget the gentleman ahead of me here that spoke about putting second dwelling on a parcel, okay? How is Montecito going to allocate that? Maybe not right now needed, but to plan for it in the future. Might be something to consider. Also, water use for open space and ag. I didn't hear too much being said about ag, but there's a lot of ag type of water use in the Montecito Basin, in the Carpinteria Basin, and how do you balance domestic use, which is what they're talking about, 2 acre-feet, and you know, the other idea is if somebody doesn't have a water meter and you don't pay attention to the water meter, you don't know whether you're using 500 gallons a day for 2 people or 80 gallons a day for 2 people. I mean, we each have to take a share, stakeholder's share in that type of personal observation. What are we using? What can we reuse? Some talk about reuse. The Europeans are way ahead of us. Okay, groundwater injection. I know I've worked with the city of Santa Barbara. I did groundwater injection in Alameda Park. We know the city does that. I worked with Goleta groundwater injection. It's one of the things that happens with the water that's stored in Lake Cachuma. When it gets full, all the water banking that's been done by Montecito, Santa Barbara, Goleta, Carpinteria, in Lake Cachuma, the banked water is what goes over the dam first when it overfills, when it spills, okay? So Montecito, I believe, has done some of this in the past. I know Goleta has a very active groundwater injection plan. And groundwater injection, to some degree, to address Mr. Cole's point earlier, it has to be of some good quality, okay? If we can build areas where we have percolating patios, where we have brick parking lots like at McKenzie Park, this all helps. Groundwater retention and basin. For the last 50 years, the state of California has spent a lot of money on flood control. 0 on dams. Water spreading areas, infiltrating, percolating into the ground is what we need to do. The recent rains have brought some of the basins up a little bit, The problem with the basins, and nobody's touched on this yet, but they're slower to react than you might think. Okay? This rain here is just not enough. You need to have a lot more to use the kind of water that people are accustomed to using.
Sir, can you kind of wind it up? You're kind of going on and on.
Sorry,
please.
I lost the point.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Just very quickly, in terms of the groundwater sustainability plan itself, Santa Barbara County is the land use authority, and the groundwater sustainability plan must be consonant with the land uses that the county has. So groundwater sustainability will take land uses into consideration. So there's obviously the county and then the Montecito community plan as well. That's all I have to say.
I want to thank all of you who came. You're with us on the beginning of this, and I want to thank DUDAC for their assistance, and we're going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.